This is part 3 of the Craftsman Emerson Generation 2 drill press rebuild. Man, that's a mouthful. If you haven't seen part 2, click the link at the top of the screen. In this video, we're going to be de-rusting, removing paint, polishing the column, and polishing some other parts. Hello everyone, I'm Jeff and welcome to my shop. We got a lot to cover, so let's get to it. Okay, so in part 2, we had put all of the parts in simple green for a 24-hour soak. And now we are removing those parts and rinsing them off and just giving them a light scrub with the wire brush. Simple green should have removed most of the oil and grease and just general grime from these parts. They still have rust on them, and that's why we're going to de-rust them. So after we've rinsed all that simple green off of them, we will be putting them in a 24-hour citric acid bath. And whenever I'm doing rinsing, I always use cold water. It just slows the surface rust process down. So if you recall from the disassembly video, the table looked like it was in some bad shape, and I may have a fix for that. But here I'm just reclaiming the simple green. I run it through a strainer before it goes back inside the 2.5 gallon jugs that it comes in. Although I think it's probably time that I throw most of this out and get some new simple green. Because one of the other reasons that I soak parts in simple green is to remove the paint. And every once in a while I run across a drill press where the paint is very stubborn. This is all the parts soaking in the citric acid bath. If you want to know more about how to do that bath, you can refer to video number 2 in the 150 series, I believe. And here we're getting ready to polish the column. And if you're wondering how to set up that poor man's lathe that I've got going there, I go into more detail with this process in video number 3 of the 150 rebuild series. But as you can see, it's just a hand drill that I've got bolted to a board and some casters that the column is resting on. And I run a piece of all thread all the way down through the column with wooden caps on the ends. And here I'm using an angle grinder with a flapper wheel. And I have 3 of these wheels, 40 grit, 60 grit, and 80 grit. So I will go all the way down the column and then come back up and then switch grits. And then normally in the 150 video, you'll know that I went to hand sanding after I used the flapper wheel. But since then, I've changed my process. I use that orbital sander. And I'm going from 80 grit all the way up to 320 grit with this orbital sander. The hand method just really wears my hands out after time. So I thought, well, I've got an orbital sander, I may as well use it. And it does a pretty good job. And so I think we're using maybe 80 grit here or 100. I'm not sure which. And like I said, we'll go all the way up to 320. So there's about 5 or 6 steps in that process. And again, we'll go all the way down the column and then come back and then switch our grit. But this puts a nice satin sheen on the column. And it would be fine to, just go to like 220 and call it a day if you don't want to polish the column. This removes all the rust from the exterior of the column and makes it more presentable. And then you could just put a coat of paste wax on it and, you'd be good to hook. But I polish my column. So after I go all the way down and back with the 320, which is what I'm on now, I believe, we'll be switching over to wet sanding. And for that, we are going to do it by hand. But as you can see, that column looks a million times better than it did when we first started. And it's got a nice polished look to it now, but not that chrome-like polish that I want. So with wet sanding, I rinse the column between each grit, and I'll start with 320 and I'm going to go up to 1,000. So that's 320, 400, 600, 800, and 1,000 grit. And I will go about 10 inches here, and then I'll wet the sandpaper and then continue, go another 10 inches, wet the sandpaper, and go all the way down, and then come all the way back with one grit, and then rinse the column off and go with the next grit. So it's a long process, but the results, you know, they speak for themselves. So after we've used the 1000 grit, which is this, you can see that finish on that column now is very highly polished, but we can go a step further. And that's when we're going to utilize one of my favorite products. So after we do the 1000, we rinse the column off and then dry it off. And after the column is dry, then we will be using Mother's Mag and aluminum polish. You can see the jar sitting there. And this is just a ShamWow that I cut up and use. And we just apply the polish all over the column. And like I said, video number 3 for the 150 series, I go into a lot more detail on this, but it's not a difficult process. It's just time consuming. So after we've got the polish all over the column, then we will go ahead and buff it off with that other piece of ShamWow that you saw me cut. I just cut them into, 2 or 3 inch wide, 12 inch or 10 inch strips. And here we are, we're just buffing it now. And we'll go all the way down and then come all the way back up. And this will give it a chrome-like finish. And there you go. So after that, I'll apply a coat of paste wax to the column. I just use Johnson's Floor paste wax, and that'll protect the column. And about once every year, I reapply the paste wax to my columns. So these are all the parts that we've pulled out of the citric acid, and we've rinsed them off, and now we're just drying them off. And everything that's not going to get paint is going to get coated with WD-40. And that's just a temporary hold on those parts so that they won't rust, or won't rust as much until we get a chance to clean them up further. Anything that is going to get paint, we do not put the WD-40 on it. Otherwise, we're just going to have to soak it in simple green again. And then after we've coated everything in WD-40, we're going to be ready to start working on some of these parts. So it was at this point that I realized that the paint did not remove very well from the base and the head of the drill press. So we're going to be going through a paint stripping step that I didn't do on the 150. So here I'm just cleaning up the spindle pulley, and that shaft that I'm sanding right now, it has bearings that ride on it, so we don't want to take any material, or not a whole lot of material, off of it. So I'm wet sanding it, and I wet sanded it with 400, 600, and then 1,000. And that's all I did to that. And since this drill press has a cover that will cover the pulleys on top, there's really no reason to polish these pulleys. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to clean them up a little bit with some 220 sandpaper. And so we just reversed it, and we'll chuck it back in the lathe. And then we're just going to set it up for some dry sanding with 220. We'll set all that wet stuff aside. We'll be using it again in a minute. So there's your 220. And I'm just cleaning up the sheaves on the pulley. Not spending a whole lot of time on it because, like I said, we're not going to polish it. So that's pretty much how it's going to look. And we do that for both pulleys. So the only difference with the motor pulley is that the shaft on the inside of it has some rust in there. So I'm just putting some sandpaper on a pencil, and I'm cleaning out the inside of the shaft, the bore there for the shaft. So next we've got the quill, and we'll just chuck that in the lathe. And although the outside of the quill does not have bearings that ride on it, it does ride through several bores inside the head. So again, we're not going to take off a lot of material, which means we're going to go with 400, 600, 800, and 1,000 grit. And we're just lightly sanding. And all we're going to do is take off that outer surface, polish it up. And, you know, there's not a lot of pressure here or anything like that. We're going over it very lightly. And we're not going to be doing anything with the inside of this. We don't want to change that inside diameter in any way, because there are bearings that go on the inside. So if you haven't watched the 150 video, anytime you do wet sanding, you want to, almost got caught by the chuck there. You want to rinse between each grit of sandpaper that you use to remove the grit. So after we've got this sanded to 1,000 grit, we're going to go ahead and polish it. Again, we're using the Mother's Mag and aluminum polish. And I'll just apply it all over it, and then we'll buff it off just like we did the column. And sorry that my arm's in the way. And if you're rebuilding a drill press, none of this is required. I just do this to make the drill press look the way I want it to look. and, perform as smooth as it possibly can. So here we have the pinion shaft, and we're going to do basically the same thing. We will polish it with 400, 600, 800, and 1000. And then we'll come back with the mother's mag and aluminum polish and polish it. And then we'll be done with that. And once we finish this end of it, we'll reverse it in the chuck, pull it out, switch it over, and then do the other side. So this is the rotor for the motor. And again, there are bearings that sit on this shaft, so we don't want to take a lot of material off. So we're going to do the same thing, except we're not going to apply the mag and aluminum polish to this. So both shafts, both ends of the shaft, I guess, will get the 400, 600, 800, and 1000. Now, as you get closer to the center on this thing, there are blades that stick out, so you've got to be very careful. And especially on this end, where you have the mount for the switch on that shaft, and when it's spinning at 600 RPMs, which is what I spin this stuff at when I sand it, it is unforgiving. It can take a finger and a heartbeat. So this is not something for somebody who doesn't know what they're doing or doesn't have experience working on a lathe to attempt, because you'll end up with one or two less digits. And all I'm going to do here is I've got a file that I'm going to clean the flat part of the shaft off with. So there's a flat there that the set screw is supposed to rest on. And so after we've cleaned that off, then we go to the sanding, 400, 600, 800, and 1000. And then we are done. So now we're doing the spindle. And again, this is another part that gets bearings on it. So we are not going to use any serious grits. We're going to be working with 400, 600, 800, and 1000 again. And the other end, the end that's inside the chuck right now, is the splined end for this. And we're going to clean the splined end up with a wire wheel, so we don't need to polish it. So that is the Jacobs taper on the end there, and you definitely don't want to take off any material there. So all we're doing is cleaning it up with this. And again, we just rinse it off between grits. And that thrust collar will come off of the spindle, but we're not removing it. So here we are with the parts that had paint on them that the paint did not remove well with the simple green. So we have the base, the head, both end frames for the motor mount, the capacitor cover, and the guard that goes on the top of the head for the drill press. So I've decided to try Citric strip, whatever it's called. And this stuff has a lot of positives to it. One, I can use it indoors. Two, it's non-toxic. And it works pretty decent. So after I've coated everything with this Citric strip, I will coat it in this unforgiving plastic wrap, cling wrap, saran wrap, whatever you want to call it, and let this stuff sit for 24 hours. And then we'll come back with a wire brush and rinse and scrub with the wire brush. Now I could have just put a wire cut brush on my angle grinder and remove the paint that way, but I've been wanting to try out this, so this was the perfect opportunity to try it. And I gotta say, I like it. It's not as fast as using the cut brush. When I'm working on a vise, I'll strip it with the cut brush on the angle grinder, and I'm done in half an hour. But it also doesn't kick up dust and everything all over my shop like the cut brush will. So yeah, we just cover everything in the saran wrap and then let it sit for 24 hours. And this stuff needs to go on kind of thick. But it did a pretty good job, as you'll see in a few minutes here. So 24 hours later, we come back and remove the saran wrap, cling wrap, plastic wrap, whatever, and rinse and scrub. And it still doesn't remove all the paint from mostly the motor mounts and the end bells, but it did a really good job on the head and base. And after I rip my gloves here a little bit later, I'll just not even use gloves, which, you know, if you've used any other strippers before, no pun intended, you know, that stuff will burn your hands in a heartbeat. And this stuff is pretty mellow. It doesn't really bother me. So those end frames are a pain in the butt. There are so many small areas that have paint in them. But here we are with the head casting, and like I said, it did a great job on this, and it did a great job on the base. And like I said, normally the simple green does 90% of this work for me, but I guess my simple green is just too used up. Time to replace it. So that'll mean a trip to Home Depot and a couple $100 later. So here's all the parts after they've been stripped. And as you can see, it did a really good job on the cast iron stuff. And that's going to wrap up this video. So if you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe. More coming soon, and I appreciate the support.